And it sounds superficial, right? Because we're all about beauty these days. But we haven't put that beauty in the hands of God. So it's vain and it's fruitless. But Esther put her beauty in the hands of God, and it became productive, and it became strategic, and it opened the door to saving thousands of her people. Hi YouTube, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be continuing our study in Esther, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the first part of Esther's divine feminine strategy. We are going to be looking at the importance of beauty, the importance of appearance, the importance of presentation. Now, this is the entire reason actually why I started this series in Esther. It was to look at how Esther used beauty, appearance, to persuade the king, to get the king's attention in order for him to do something that was not only good, but of God. Okay, so let's turn our Bibles to Esther chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the royal or inner court of the king's palace opposite his throne room. The king was sitting on his throne, facing the main entrance of the palace. And when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What will you have, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of the kingdom." Actually, this is not the version that I meant to read. It's the amplified version, but it doesn't matter. So in my last video, I talked about how Esther had gone into fasting and praying, and how I believe that Esther was receiving divine strategy about how to approach the king in order for this to be a successful endeavor. The actions that Esther takes immediately after this fast were probably what she got during that time of prayer and fasting. And this is just my opinion, so take that as you will. The first thing that I'd like to point out is how this is the third day of the fast. So what is the first thing that Esther does immediately following the fast? Esther put on her royal robes. Now, if you remember back to my Proverbs 31 series about dressing like royalty, you'll notice that the Proverbs 31 woman wore fabrics that were reserved for royalty. They were reserved for people who were priests. I talked about how it is a part of your responsibility, I can say, as a woman, to present yourself with a great amount of dignity, to make sure that you put effort into the way that you present yourself, to dress in a way, in a fashion that not only reminds the world who you are and whose you are, who you belong to, which is God, but also to remind yourself of who God says you are. And right here in this first verse of Esther 5, I can see Esther implementing this great amount of feminine wisdom, you might say, which is that the first thing that she does out of fasting is to make sure you look good. Don't come out of fasting looking like you have been fasting. And there are scriptures even in the Bible that say that when you fast, wash your face. Don't look like you are suffering. So the first thing that Esther does is she gets dressed. She puts on her makeup, she puts on her jewelry, she puts on her perfume or whatever it is that they put on in those days. And she presents herself in a fashion that is appealing, that she knows will be appealing to the king. So she puts on her royal robes, she gets dressed, she looks good before she even approaches his throne. And then she did something that I think is also very interesting. So she got herself ready, she presented herself well, but then she positioned herself in the line of vision of the king. She didn't come bum rushing him, she didn't come begging him. And if you read Ruth, you'll also see that Naomi gave Ruth this wisdom, which is just position yourself in a place where this man cannot miss you, okay? And he will tell you what to do, I believe is what Naomi told Ruth. And Esther also uses this wisdom. She doesn't come nagging the king or wailing and crying and a mess, which is sometimes how women think that they can obtain what they need to obtain or get what they need to get, whether it be sympathy or help from a man. They think, oh, if I whine, if I complain, if I nag, if I cry, if I look like a mess, then I will get what I want because I'll bother him into it. But this is not how Esther approaches this. No, she looks fantastic. She looks composed. She puts on her royal robes. She carries herself with dignity, and she just positions herself in the line of vision of the king. Almost as if she was saying, what this man will see is all the communication I need. I don't need to open my mouth. I don't need to cry. I don't need to wail. I don't need to throw myself at his feet. I don't need to nag. I just need to show up in my most dignified fashion. And I think that that is a very deep and profound thing to meditate on, something that I will meditate on. How is it that I approach getting what I need in life? Not just men, just in life. Do I carry myself with dignity, or do I carry myself as a victim who needs all this support and sympathy? Is it possible that you might actually get more done by coming and approaching things with a great deal of dignity, a great deal of self-assurance, knowing who you are, dressing and presenting yourself in your most dignified fashion? Because Esther too, just like Mordecai, could have come in sackcloth, wailing and crying, in tattered clothes, disheveled, trying to provoke the king. And if Esther would have done that, I would say Esther was being manipulative. As it stands right now, she washed her face, she made herself look good, she put on her perfume, she put on her royal robes, she presented herself with dignity, and she simply positioned herself in front of the king and allowed him to open the door for her. Now, what was the result of her just simply presenting herself in the best fashion? What was the result of this part of the divine feminine strategy that Esther might have received in that 3-day fast? Well, in verse 2, it says, "And when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight." So I want to point out that it says, as soon as he saw her, she obtained favor in his sight. This was not just any kind of favor. This was favor in his sight. It means the kind of favor that you get upon being seen. This is how I know that this must have been God. Because if you remember back to my first video on Esther, I talked about King Xerxes' love of beauty. The way that he decorated his palace, the way that he decorated his festivals, the way that he shared his wealth with the kingdom, with his subjects, with his officials, the way that he wanted Queen Vashti to come and show her beauty. This was a man who loved beauty. And I believe that in that fasting period, in that prayer posture that Esther submitted herself to before the Lord reminded Esther, this is a man who loves beauty. Do not show up to him a wreck. This is a man who opens doors for beautiful women, for beautiful things in his life. So the first thing that you need to do to crack the door open, to prop the door open for this strategy to work, is you need to crack the door of sight. You need to influence him visually before you request something verbally. And there's other things that Esther did after this that further opened the door for her to make her request. But this was the first thing that Esther did. The first thing that Esther did to unlock this man's heart was to influence him through his sight. This actually is something that may apply to many men. It is something to take note of, that men are often influenced first by their sight. So it says that he held out his golden scepter, and Esther drew near. there is a kind of patience and an ability to observe a situation that I think needs to be noted here. Esther, like I said, did not rush into his throne room and throw herself at his feet. She positioned herself and then she waited. She waited for him to be ready to accept her. She did not violate his boundary. And I did a series on boundaries much earlier, way before the Proverbs 31 series. I did a series on boundaries and how boundaries need to be respected. And the king had a boundary. You don't just walk into his court. You don't just start complaining about your issues to him. And Esther respected her husband's boundary. So she looked good, she presented herself, she positioned herself in his sight, and then she waited for him to open the door. Now this was you might say, a literal opening of the door when he finally extended his scepter, but it was also a figurative opening of the door. He allowed her within his boundary line because she showed respect. She waited for him to invite her in. And what was the first thing that the king said? "What will you have, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to half of the kingdom." Esther already had this man asking her what she needed. She didn't even have to open her mouth and say, "There's a problem, I need your help," nothing like that. To me, this is real power. This is real influence in the most feminine of ways. You see, I don't see feminine power as something that is aggressive rather than something that is secure, something that is knowing, something that is being. Esther did not have to be aggressive in her efforts. She had to be strategic. She had to know what she was doing, who she was dealing with, who she was approaching on behalf of, which was God. And that confidence, that knowing of what your assignment is, who's giving you this assignment, and who you are approaching is enough to open the door. And that's what I think I get from Esther, is that she knew exactly who she was, whose she was, and what kind of power she held in exactly her position. She didn't go trying to usurp the king's power. She didn't go complaining about her small position as the queen. She didn't go around complaining to everyone that she wasn't called to the king's palace for 30 days. No, she knew who she was, and even with the help of Mordecai, she remembered whose she was, which was God's. And this confidence and this sense of dignity and this ability to present yourself as such is what opened the door for Esther, to the point that the king's immediate response to Esther's presence was, "What do you need? How can I help? What can I fix? I'll give you half of everything I have." She didn't even open her mouth yet. She hasn't even told him that there's a problem. This woman understood power. She understood the way women wield power. For this video, I just wanted to focus on Esther's use of beauty, because the way that Esther uses beauty is the same way that God uses beauty. If you think about the way that a flower attracts the attention of certain insects in order for the insects to land on the petals so that the flowers can cross-pollinate and continue to flourish. So God uses beauty as a part of the function of the planet. He uses it to continue and progress a system. Beauty is not vain in the hands of God, which is why Esther's efforts were fruitful and Queen Vashti's efforts led to her banishment. Beauty in the hands of God is always productive. Beauty in the hands of God always has a function. And Esther allowed herself to be used by God. She humbled herself in fasting and prayer. And I believe during that time of fasting and prayer, God revealed to her, your weapon is your beauty. And it sounds superficial, right? Because we're all about beauty these days. But we haven't put that beauty in the hands of God. So it's vain and it's fruitless. But Esther put her beauty in the hands of God, and it became productive, and it became strategic, and it opened the door to saving thousands of her people. And it was at this point that I realized years ago that beauty is something to take seriously. Don't just allow yourself to look anyhow. Don't just walk out your door looking anyhow. You have no idea what king you'll come across whose heart needs to be opened, whose boundary has been barricaded. But because they saw you, they softened. Because they saw you, they extended their golden scepter and allowed you into their inner court. You have no clue how God is going to use you as a Trojan horse of sorts to deliver his word, his gospel, his message, because you took your beauty, your presentation seriously. And that is when beauty no longer looked superficial to me. Suddenly, beauty was just as deep as me studying the scriptures. Suddenly, beauty was just as deep as me studying anything. My personal growth was not just internal, it had to be external as well, because I realized that God has need of it. He has need of the flowers to be beautiful. He has need of the landscape to be gorgeous. He has need of these things to look attractive, including you and me. He has kings whose hearts need to be softened. He has kings who need to extend their golden scepter to you so that he can deliver what he needs to deliver. I hope that I've been able to communicate the core of the reason why I started this series. Some of these things that we disdain, taking care of our appearance, being able to submit and obey, being able to fast and pray to prepare, being able to respect the men in our life. Some of these things that we have learned over the years, over many decades, over many generations to disdain, to dismiss, to belittle, God has need of them. And Esther knew how to combine these things and save a nation. She understood the power of these things, and she became one of the most powerful women mentioned in the entire Bible. So I hope I was able to convey to you a little bit of what God has revealed to me concerning beauty in this video through the story of Esther. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have anything to share, please leave it in the comments below. Please share it with your friends, subscribe. And until my next video, have a wonderful weekend. God bless. Bye.